President Biden's runaway train of spending is just getting started. After a $2 trillion COVID relief bill, he's now looking to spend another $2 trillion on infrastructure. How do we slow down this wild spending? How do we deal with a crisis unfolding at the border? We're going to bring in Kansas Senator Roger Marshall to discuss. He joins us live. Good afternoon to you, Senator. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. You know, I want to talk to you specifically, starting a little bit with this spending, because look, as I was telling our foreign members of Congress before, the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, that was less than the over $4 trillion we spent under President Trump to deal with the response to COVID. Now we're spending another $2 trillion for President Biden. Now he's proposing another $2 trillion on top of that. You know, at some point, people do realize this money has to get paid back one way or another.
Right, Joe. So first of all, this is the grab your wallet tax bill. They're using the label infrastructure, but there's very little infrastructure in there. Just for instance, there's only about $110 billion for traditional roads and bridges, $110 billion, but there's $170 billion for electric car chargers. So we're going to spend 70% more on car generators. They're going to put electric car generator on every street corner. They want to put a wind turbine in every backyard and a solar panel on every rooftop. So this really should be labeled the grab your wallet Green New Deal. So little bit's in infrastructure. So it's a misnomer and just very sad for our country's future.
Well, really, I'm glad you touched on that. We're going to talk about this a little later in the show. But, you know, it seems as if the big ideas for President Biden is to kind of retrofit yesterday's solutions and hope that they'll work in the future. You talked about, you know, where the money is being spent in this infrastructure bill that has very little infrastructure in it, the same way we had a COVID bill that had very little COVID in it. How do we get people to understand that the objective is not always as important as the actual methods? Because even if you look at something like our railway infrastructure, you've got high-speed rail in China, you've got high-speed rail in Japan, and in America, we have an Amtrak Acela that just skips some stops. The average speed being somewhere around 65 miles an hour, when we could be having people get from places like South Dakota to Texas in a matter of hours or minutes. Talk to us a little bit about how we need to have a 21st century looking infrastructure plan, and that is not what's occurring right now.
Right. So if we're going to borrow another $2 trillion from our grandchildren, what's the best way to spend it? That's the way I look at most every problem is how it's going to impact my grandchildren. I'm more interested in that than I am what the Twitter feed's going to say after we finish this particular show. So what are the long-term solutions that we need for this country? And, you know, you're starting to describe them. Certainly we need our roads and bridges updated. High-speed internet is going to be very important for future generations. I'm all for investing money in that. Some type of a transportation project that's going to get people from Houston to Los Angeles, from Houston to Great Bend, Kansas. I'm all for those types of things as well. Got to figure out how to pay for them and keep prioritizing them as well. But what won't work is if we keep moving our policy towards a Green New Deal that's unaffordable, it's going to drive up the price of gasoline at the pump. It's going to drive up the cost of electricity for folks trying to heat their houses as well. So we got to keep our eye on the ball. They're going to keep coming up with these misnomers. America's going to have to look and see what's actually in the bill.
I want to shift our eyes down to the southern border. Obviously, the Biden administration and their allies in the media keep trying to find ways to lay the burdens of the crisis at the feet of President Trump. Meanwhile, we've seen a threefold increase of children in detention centers. We've seen border crossings go from around 36,000 in February of last year over 100,000 in February reported. Those are the numbers that we have. What hope do we have, number one, at actually staunching some of the bleeding that's happening at the border, and then two, finding some type of bipartisan agreement to make sure that we can secure the border and also deal with the immigration crisis that has plagued this nation for far too long?
Well, certainly that's up in many ways to what the president and leadership on the Democrat side wants to do. For me, it all starts with securing the border. We've had legislation on the House floor twice we voted on legislation, $25 billion for President Trump's securing the border, as well as fixing we want to make sure we have legal merit-based immigration. So we've seen what that legislation looks like. But the Democrats want this problem. They're not even willing to recognize that there's a crisis right now. By all measures, the situation today, 3 to 5 times worse than it ever was during President Trump. But they're not going to call it a crisis yet. But I've been to the border 3 times. This is a humanitarian crisis. It's a health crisis. It's a national security crisis. So it starts with recognizing that there's a challenge, that there is indeed a crisis there. And it's also any type of long-term solution. We need border security, right? So it's so frustrating to fly over the river and see these miles and miles of wall that's been built, but still in many cases, there's a gate that needs to be placed there yet. About every 20, 30 miles, there's a big gate. And what we're seeing is people are being paid to quit working. So someone from the federal government has asked the general contractors to stop working. Money that's been appropriated to finish the wall is not being used. So, to answer your question is, I think that we need the Democrats to need to agree that border security is part of the solution here.
Now, to that point, the Senate used to be what people called the most deliberative body on the planet. Now it seems as if we're getting closer and closer to that type of food fight you would find in the House. How do we just get back to the Senate being a place where we can call balls and strikes, where we can deal with the priorities of the nation that are maybe in some ways disjoint from the politics that keep us divided? What do we need to do to deal with this humanitarian crisis that we have at the border, this security crisis that we have at the border, but also all of the things that are facing the American people right now to ensure that they know that we're taking care of our number one priority, which is to keep the American people safe in their homes.
Right. So, President Biden campaigned on having a moderate policy, but instead, all we've seen come out of his administration is an extreme radical socialist policy.
Right.
So I think when you're starting so far to the left, it's hard to find some spot in the middle that you can work towards. I just think that what President Biden and his folks don't realize is they do not represent majoritarian values. That I still think the supermajority of Americans want a secure border. They want election integrity. They want their Second Amendment. We want our God-given rights protected and our constitutional rights protected as well. So I think somehow they got to start a little bit closer to the middle for us to be able to even have this conversation. And so far, there's just been nothing. No one has reached out from the president's office or from Senator Schumer's office over the Republicans to say, hey, give us some input. Typically, we got, $4 trillion of COVID relief done on a bipartisan basis. We've done infrastructure legislation in the past on a bipartisan basis. But so far, really, no one's reaching across the aisle. And to some extent, it depends on the majority folks to reach across the aisle to the minority. One more reason, but we need the filibuster, is to force the majority party to reach out and work with the minority for long-term solutions.
Well, to that point, you talk about things that all Americans should be able to agree on. Most Americans, you ask them today, they want children back in school. Most experts, when you talk about is it safe for our children to be in the schools, all the experts across the board seem to be in alignment of the fact that the school is actually one of the safest places for children to be during COVID, whether we're talking about the increase in suicide rates, whether you're talking about the low rates of transmission. All of those things lead us to making sure we want to have kids in school. Democrats basically fought tooth and nail to prevent us from having any clawbacks in that COVID bill that would have made sure that states that took money had an obligation to open the doors to the schoolhouses. How do we, in spite of that, make sure that we're providing our children with the education they need when the data shows us that virtual learning has left many children far, far behind?
Yeah, Joe, all those are great points. Number one is we're going to lose more children and youth from suicide, from overdoses, than die from the COVID virus. And that mental health crisis that has been created by shutting down the economy and by shutting down our schools. And really, we knew this back in April and May of last year, and I was talking about it then. So it's not surprising. It's very frustrating. I think for all practical purposes, the seasonal flu is worse on youth than this particular virus is as well. So there's really no excuse now. There's no excuse at all. And let me just pause and say thanks to all the teachers that did get out there and that have had our students back in school. I know my community colleges across the state of Kansas, all of their students have been in person this semester. And I think at this point, I can say that every school district in the state of Kansas, majority of those kids are back in school as well. We're almost to herd immunity.
Right.
I've been predicting since Thanksgiving time we'd have herd immunity probably by April or May, and I think we're going to make it. So we need to keep investing in schools. Education is the great equalizer of opportunity. I still believe in this country that anybody can be anything that they want to be. I'm a first-generation college kid that's got to live the American dream, and education is one of the pillars and the basis for that American dream.
Absolutely. It is that silver bullet that allows people to have that better outcomes than the previous generation. Senator Roger Marshall, thank you so much for joining us, sir. God bless. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.